The world celebrated victory in Europe on May 8, 1945. Streets in London, Paris, and New York exploded with relief. Flags waved and champagne flowed. The Allies had triumphed. Or so everyone thought. But in the dense forests of central Germany, a fierce battle raged on, unknown to the world. Soldiers fought with unwavering courage, civilians clung to hope, and a shadow of conflict threatened to undermine the fragile peace. This is the story of a battle that happened after Germany surrendered, a forgotten conflict that challenges the notion of a clean end to World War II. Chapter 1. The world celebrates, but the war doesn't end everywhere. May 7, 1945 marked Germany's official surrender. In Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender documents for Nazi Germany, bringing formal closure to a war that had ravaged Europe for 6 years. Across the Atlantic, President Harry Truman addressed the American people with a mix of triumph and solemnity, declaring victory in Europe and promising a return to normalcy. Yet the realities on the ground were starkly different. The vastness of Europe, combined with disrupted communication networks, meant that news traveled unevenly. German units scattered across the countryside, in forests, bunkers, and small towns, were isolated from command centers in major cities. Many soldiers and officers either did not know about the surrender or refused to accept it, believing in Nazi propaganda that victory could still be salvaged. In southern Germany, near the Bavarian hills, pockets of resistance remained entrenched. These units were determined, heavily armed, and desperate. They weren't just fighting for ideology, they were fighting for survival, for honor, and for a way to preserve what remained of the Third Reich. Meanwhile, Allied forces were cautiously advancing, encountering scattered resistance in villages that had expected liberation. What was supposed to be a victory march turned into skirmishes that were unexpected, deadly, and emotionally taxing. Chapter 2. Soldiers in Limbo, Confusion and Courage. Private James Reynolds, a young American infantryman from Ohio, had been through the Battle of the Bulge and countless skirmishes across France and Germany. He had seen the horrors of war, the devastation of towns, and the human cost of global conflict. On May 8th, he had expected to rest, celebrate, and finally see the end of the fighting. Instead, his unit received reports of German soldiers attacking a small supply convoy near the town of Langenberg. Reynolds recalled the tense march through destroyed villages, the constant smell of gunpowder and burning homes, and the eerie silence that had replaced once bustling streets. The German units responsible for these attacks were remnants of the 11th Panzer Division, unaware of the surrender or refusing to acknowledge it. Their commander, Oberstleutnant Friedrich Lang, was a veteran officer who believed surrender was a betrayal of honor. He ordered his men to continue the fight, hoping to inflict casualties and disrupt the Allied advance, even as the larger war officially ended. Reynolds' platoon was ordered to intercept the attackers. What ensued was chaotic. Ambushes in dense forests, mortar fire that ripped through the quiet countryside, and hand-to-hand combat in small villages. The Allies faced a deadly paradox, fighting a battle after the official war had ended, where every soldier understood the futility, yet had to survive and protect civilians during the war's final hours. Chapter 3. Civilians in the Crossfire. The villages in southern Germany bore the brunt of this unexpected conflict. Families who had prepared to welcome liberation were now hiding in cellars, barns, and forested hillsides. In the town of Altenburg, an elderly schoolteacher, Frau Hilda Meier, described how she and her neighbors huddled in the basement as gunfire echoed above. "They kept shooting, even when we thought the war was over," she later recalled in a testimony collected in 1946. I remember thinking, if this is peace, then I never want to see it again. Children clutched their parents, whispering questions about why the soldiers were still fighting, why the radio said the war was over, and why their world had not yet returned to normal. Civilians faced a difficult choice: flee and risk being caught in crossfire, or stay and endure the terror of a battle that should not have existed. Allied and American units often went out of their way to minimize civilian casualties, attempting to negotiate surrenders from isolated German units. However, mistrust and fear on both sides often escalated violence. Soldiers reported seeing families caught in shelling, homes destroyed, and livestock killed, compounding the tragedy. Chapter 4: Heroism Amid Chaos. Even in these last fragmented battles, acts of heroism stood out. Sergeant William Bill Hargrove, an experienced platoon leader, was credited with saving dozens of civilians in a small Bavarian town. Facing a German machine gun nest in a farmhouse, Hargrove coordinated a flanking maneuver under heavy fire, risking his life to evacuate a group of women and children trapped inside. Meanwhile, Private Reynolds displayed courage that would later earn him a commendation. When a squad mate was pinned down by sniper fire, Reynolds charged across open ground, drawing fire and allowing his comrade to escape. These actions were not motivated by glory. They were motivated by survival, empathy, and the unexpected responsibility of protecting civilians during the war's final hours. Oberstleutnant Wang, for all his rigid adherence to Nazi ideology, also displayed a form of military honor. When confronted with overwhelming force, he allowed some civilians and soldiers to surrender without executing reprisals, adhering to the older codes of warfare, even while continuing resistance elsewhere. Chapter 5: Skirmishes that shaped the local landscape. The aftermath of these battles left deep scars on the local geography. Forests were riddled with trenches, abandoned weapons littered the hills, and villages bore the marks of repeated shelling and small arms engagements. The unexpected combat extended across southern Germany into Austria, where isolated German units had retreated after the surrender. Maps drawn by Allied intelligence later showed hotspots of post-surrender fighting, with detailed notes on troop movements, casualties, and destroyed infrastructure. While globally the war had ended, these localized conflicts consumed resources and tested soldiers' endurance. Historians later noted that these battles highlighted a critical truth: wars do not end neatly. Even after formal declarations, human communication delays, ideology, and personal motivations can create conflict where peace is assumed. The Battle of Langenberg, among others, serves as a case study in how the last battles of World War II were as deadly and complex as the initial campaigns. Chapter 6: Psychological Toll on Soldiers. For American soldiers, the mental strain was significant. The knowledge that Germany had surrendered, yet fighting continued, created confusion and moral dilemmas. Many questioned whether their actions were justified, whether they were continuing to kill unnecessarily, and how to reconcile the official end of the war with their lived experiences. Reynolds wrote in a letter to his mother, "Mom, they keep telling us the war is over, but every morning we wake to gunfire, explosions, and the faces of frightened civilians. How can it be over if people are still dying?" Such reflections were common among soldiers. Post-traumatic stress was compounded by the ambiguous end, making the transition to peace more difficult than in prior conflicts. Psychologists studying veterans later described this period as a war within the peace, where the official victory did not immediately translate to emotional or practical security. Chapter 8: Unexpected Alliances and Negotiations. Not all encounters ended in violence. Some German commanders, realizing the futility of further combat, negotiated with Allied officers to surrender formally in isolated areas. Lieutenant Karl Weiss, for instance, led a contingent in the Black Forest and met with American officers under a white flag. These negotiations often involved high tension, mutual distrust, and careful strategy to prevent misunderstandings that could reignite hostilities. In several instances, these surrenders allowed for the rescue of civilians who had been trapped in conflict zones for days. Supplies were distributed, and makeshift medical stations treated both soldiers and civilians. These localized peace agreements became essential in transitioning from combat to post-war recovery, highlighting the role of negotiation even in the shadow of global victory. Chapter 8. The Media and the Forgotten Battle. International media celebrated the end of the war, yet very few journalists reported on these post-surrender skirmishes. By the time
reporters reached Germany, many units had already disbanded, and civilians were eager to focus on rebuilding. This lack of coverage contributed to the battle being largely forgotten in mainstream history. Surviving records, letters, and official military dispatches, however, preserved the truth. Decades later, historians pieced together the narratives, revealing how bravery, confusion, and human endurance persisted even after the official surrender. The battle demonstrated that the end of a war is not always a singular, celebrated moment, but a complex, staggered process involving countless individual stories of struggle, heroism, and tragedy. Chapter 9. The Langenberg Ambush Intensifies. As the sun rose over the Bavarian hills, the quiet morning was shattered by distant gunfire. Private James Reynolds and his squad had just set up a temporary camp near the outskirts of Langenberg. The men were weary, having marched for days through destroyed villages, sleeping in barns and hollowed-out cellars. They were anticipating the end of hostilities, but fate had other plans. Suddenly, a German unit, hidden in dense pine forests, launched a surprise attack on an Allied supply convoy. Mortars exploded in clouds of dust and smoke, and bullets tore through the air. Reynolds dove behind a broken wall of rubble, clutching his rifle, his heart hammering as he realized that even after Germany's surrender, lives were at stake. Corporal Richard Hayes, Reynolds' squad leader, barked orders: "Return fire! Protect the convoy!" The Americans countered, engaging in a chaotic exchange that lasted hours. Unlike previous battles, there was no strategic goal beyond survival. Each soldier fought for his life, for his comrades, and for the civilians who were trapped in the crossfire. The German commander, Oberstleutnant Lang, had meticulously planned this ambush. His forces were small, but disciplined, skilled in guerrilla tactics learned from previous campaigns. They used the terrain to their advantage, firing from concealed positions and retreating before the Americans could mount a full assault. This cat-and-mouse dynamic created tension, fear, and confusion, challenging the Allied forces' assumptions about the war's end. Chapter 10. Civilians Caught in the Crossfire. In the nearby town of Altenburg, civilians had been hoping for a peaceful liberation. Instead, the streets became battlefields. Women, children, and the elderly hid in basements, peering through cracked doors to watch soldiers maneuver through town. Frau Hilda Meier, who had survived the initial shelling, recounted the terrifying hours when American tanks rolled into the village. "I thought the war was over. I could see the stars in the sky, and yet the bombs fell. My neighbors, my friends, we prayed that no one would be hurt, but there was no place safe." Children whispered questions. Why are they still fighting? And is the war over? For them, the concept of surrender was abstract. They only knew fear, uncertainty, and the hope that somehow someone would protect them. The Allies, understanding the stakes, prioritized evacuation where possible.
Makeshift safe zones were established in churches, schools, and cellars. Soldiers like Reynolds became reluctant guardians, carrying children through shell fire, shielding families, and providing what comfort they could in a time of chaos. Chapter 11. Expected Alliances. Amidst the chaos, unexpected alliances formed. Some German soldiers, realizing the futility of continued resistance, negotiated with Allied commanders. In one forest clearing, Lieutenant Carl Weiss met with Captain Samuel Brooks of the U.S. Army under a white flag. The discussion was tense, mistrust ran high, weapons remained ready, and any misstep could trigger renewed combat. Yet, after hours of negotiation, Weiss agreed to surrender his unit, ensuring the safety of nearby villagers. This rare collaboration demonstrated that even amidst chaos, humanity could prevail. Soldiers on both sides navigated the complex moral terrain of post-surrender conflict, making choices that would affect the lives of civilians and combatants alike. Chapter 12. Tactical Lessons from a Post-Surrender Battle. Military historians later analyzed the Langenburg engagement as a case study in post-surrender warfare. They noted several key tactical lessons. 1. Isolation creates pockets of resistance. Disconnected units may continue fighting due to delayed communication or ideological commitment. 2. Guerrilla tactics prolong conflict. Small, disciplined groups can inflict significant casualties, even against larger forces. 3. Civilian safety complicates operations. Efforts to minimize civilian casualties slowed combat and required creative problem-solving. 4. Psychological impact. Soldiers' awareness of the official surrender conflicted with on-the-ground realities, influencing decision-making and morale. These lessons remain relevant in modern military strategy, illustrating that formal declarations of victory do not always translate to immediate peace. Chapter 13. Heroic Acts and Personal Sacrifice. During a particularly intense skirmish, Reynolds' unit encountered a German sniper hiding in a church steeple. The sniper had pinned down American soldiers for hours, threatening both military and civilian lives. Reynolds, recognizing the danger, volunteered to neutralize the threat. Crawling under enemy fire, he reached the base of the steeple, climbed the stairs, and managed to incapacitate the sniper with a single precise shot. Meanwhile, Sergeant Hargrove led a damning rescue operation for a family trapped in a bombed-out house. He coordinated a team under heavy fire, braving shrapnel and bullets to ensure the family's escape. Such acts of courage were not isolated. They occurred repeatedly across southern Germany, forming a network of human heroism in a chaotic and morally ambiguous battlefield. Chapter 14. The Aftermath of the Langenburg Battle. After days of combat, the region began to stabilize. German units either surrendered or retreated to isolated areas. The immediate threat to civilians diminished, and Allied forces began clearing the battlefield. The cost was substantial. Dozens of soldiers on both sides were killed, hundreds injured, and entire villages bore physical and emotional scars. Local townspeople struggled with the sudden transition from war to peace. Buildings needed reconstruction, food and water supplies were scarce, and the trauma of sudden violence lingered. Historians later described this as a second wave of wartime suffering, where victory on paper did not immediately translate to security on the ground. Chapter 15. The Broader Historical Implications. The Langenburg engagement, though forgotten in mainstream narratives, highlights several critical truths. Wars end unevenly. Official surrender dates are symbolic. Actual cessation of violence can lag significantly. Human behavior shapes conflict. Ideology, fear, and loyalty drive individuals to continue fighting even after formal victory. Civilian impact is profound.
Even small-scale engagements affect thousands of innocent lives, altering local demographics and social dynamics. Legacy of heroism. Acts of courage, compassion, and ethical decision-making leave lasting impressions on history, even in battles officially over. Chapter 16. Soldiers reflect on their experiences. In letters, diaries, and later interviews, soldiers recounted the surreal experience of fighting after the war's official end. Reynolds wrote, "We celebrated victory in our hearts, but every morning the rifle fire reminded us that peace was fragile. It wasn't enough to sign papers. Peace had to be won again, block by block, village by village." Psychologists later analyzed these reflections, noting the unique mental strain of post-surrender conflict. Veterans had to reconcile the relief of victory with the immediate threat of continued violence, a duality that complicated reintegration into civilian life and influenced post-war policies for veteran support. Chapter 17. Remembering the Forgotten Battle. Despite its significance, the Langenberg Battle and similar post-surrender conflicts were largely absent from history textbooks. They existed in military archives, personal diaries, and oral histories. Only decades later did researchers piece together these events, revealing a rich tapestry of courage, confusion, and moral complexity that persisted even after the official end of World War II.
Chapter 18. The Retreat into Austria. After the skirmishes in Langenberg, German forces retreated southward toward the Austrian Alps. Many units, confused by conflicting orders and slow communication, moved in small, disorganized groups. These remnants were determined to continue fighting, not for victory, but for survival and honor. American and British forces pursued cautiously. Allied commanders understood that engaging these fragmented units posed unique challenges. The terrain was treacherous, with dense forests, steep valleys, and snow-capped peaks. Civilians were scattered across remote villages, and German soldiers were experienced in guerrilla tactics. Private James Reynolds' unit was assigned to advance into the Tyrol region of Austria. The soldiers faced extreme weather, logistical difficulties, and constant tension. Despite knowing the war had officially ended, they were thrust into combat that tested endurance, strategy, and morality. Chapter 19. The Austrian Villages Under Siege. Small villages like Zell am See and Kitzbühel, which had largely been spared during the main campaigns, suddenly found themselves caught in the crossfire. Local inhabitants had just begun rebuilding from the previous months of uncertainty. Schools reopened, shops tried to restock, and families attempted to resume a semblance of normal life. Then came the unexpected violence. German stragglers, seeking supplies and hiding from Allied advances, entered villages forcibly. American units, including Reynolds' squad, responded with a mixture of defensive maneuvers and negotiations. Civilians were evacuated where possible, and barricades were set up to prevent collateral damage. One Austrian family, the Grubers, hid in a cellar for 3 days while gunfire and artillery echoed overhead. Father Franz Gruber later described the experience. "We thought the war was over. Every night we prayed for dawn to bring peace. But the soldiers, on both sides, fought as if the world had not changed. Our lives were caught between two armies, neither of which cared about our fear." Chapter 20. Tactical Challenges in Mountain Warfare. Fighting in the Alps presented new tactical challenges. Narrow mountain passes limited troop movements and made large-scale maneuvers impossible. Small units relied on stealth, reconnaissance, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Reynolds' platoon frequently encountered German snipers perched on rocky outcrops. Mortar teams had to calculate angles with precision, or any misfire could devastate nearby civilians or friendly forces. Communication difficulties persisted, radios had limited range, and maps were often outdated due to shifting front lines. Despite these obstacles, Allied soldiers adapted quickly.
Training from previous campaigns, coupled with ingenuity and experience, allowed small units to engage effectively while minimizing civilian casualties. Every successful operation became a testament to tactical skill and human resilience. Chapter 21. Acts of Courage Amidst Chaos. In the Alpine skirmishes, acts of heroism continued to emerge. Corporal Hayes led a daring mission to rescue a group of stranded villagers from a mountain hamlet surrounded by German stragglers. The operation involved crossing ice-covered streams under fire, navigating narrow ledges, and confronting armed enemies in close quarters. Private Reynolds documented another incident in his diary. A German soldier had surrendered after being surrounded in a barn, but a rogue sniper threatened both the prisoner and nearby civilians. Reynolds took initiative, confronting the sniper and neutralizing the threat without causing harm to the captive. These moments highlight the moral complexity soldiers faced, balancing duty, survival, and compassion in the final hours of the conflict. Chapter 22. Humanitarian efforts amidst conflict. Allied medical teams worked tirelessly to assist both soldiers and civilians. Field hospitals were set up in remote locations, sometimes inside repurposed barns or abandoned monasteries. Medical staff faced shortages of supplies, harsh conditions, and the constant threat of renewed combat. One nurse, Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan, recounted treating wounds from both American and German soldiers. She emphasized the ethical imperative of caring for all, noting, "War has no favorites. The wounded, the frightened, the innocent, they all deserve our help." In these last battles, compassion became as vital as courage. Chapter 23. The Psychological Impact on Soldiers and Civilians. The prolonged conflict had profound psychological effects. Soldiers faced moral dilemmas: continue fighting against an officially defeated enemy, risk lives unnecessarily, or find ways to minimize violence. Diaries and letters from the period reveal anxiety, frustration, and trauma. Reynolds wrote to his sister, "The war is supposed to be over, but every hill hides danger. Every shadow could be a gun. We are soldiers without closure, fighting ghosts of a war that should have ended days ago." Civilians, too, experienced heightened fear. Communities previously untouched by combat suddenly faced destruction and uncertainty. The combination of surprise attacks, isolation, and the lingering threat of violence created a climate of constant tension, complicating post-war recovery efforts. Chapter 24. Unexpected Encounters. Not all interactions were violent. Some German soldiers, realizing the futility of resistance, sought dialogue with Allied forces. One notable encounter involved a German lieutenant who approached Reynolds' unit under a white flag, seeking medical assistance for injured comrades. Negotiations were tense but successful. The Germans surrendered their weapons, allowing civilians to emerge safely and ensuring that no further bloodshed occurred in that hamlet. These moments underscore the unpredictable nature of post-surrender conflict. Hostility coexisted with humanity, and enemy combatants could become partners in preserving life. Chapter 26. Local Resistance and Civilian Courage. Austrian civilians themselves played an active role in mitigating the conflict. Local militia groups, previously formed to resist Nazi occupation, assisted in guiding Allied forces through the mountains, providing intelligence on German positions and helping evacuate vulnerable populations. One village elder, Herr Leopold, described the courage required. "We had lived through occupation, we had hidden our children, and yet we had to step out and guide foreign soldiers through our forests. Fear never left us, but neither did the need to act." These civilian contributions were crucial, demonstrating that even after formal surrender, the outcome of local engagements depended on collective bravery and cooperation. Chapter 27. The Role of Communication and Intelligence. Post-surrender battles highlighted the importance of communication. Delays in disseminating the news of Germany's surrender allowed isolated units to continue combat operations. Allied intelligence officers worked around the clock to locate and coordinate these remaining pockets of resistance. Signal interception, reconnaissance flights, and local informants played pivotal roles. Every piece of information could mean the difference between life and death, underscoring that wars are fought not only with weapons, but with knowledge. Chapter 28. The Costs of Misunderstanding. Tragically, miscommunication led to unnecessary casualties. In one instance, a German unit believed Allied forces were targeting civilians deliberately, prompting a defensive response that escalated into deadly combat. Only later did both sides realize that the conflict could have been avoided through clearer communication. These incidents emphasize the complexity of ending wars. Even when nations declare peace, local misunderstandings, fear, and mistrust can perpetuate violence. The human cost is significant, as ordinary soldiers and civilians pay the price for delayed or fragmented information. Chapter 28. Small Victories and Moral Triumphs. Despite the dangers, small victories provided hope. Rescued families, surrendered German units, and successfully cleared villages signified progress. Soldiers like Reynolds and Hargrove gained not only tactical victories, but also moral reassurance. They were protecting life and restoring order, even in a war that had officially ended. These triumphs, though minor in the scope of global history, carried immense significance for those directly affected. Each successful operation marked a step toward lasting peace, highlighting the interplay between strategic action and ethical responsibility.
Chapter 39. The Push into the Bavarian Alps. Following the partial stabilization in Tyrol, Allied forces prepared for a more deliberate push into the southern Bavarian Alps. Intelligence reports indicated several isolated German units entrenched in mountain passes, determined to continue fighting despite the formal surrender. Private James Reynolds' squad, alongside other infantry and armored units, advanced cautiously. The terrain was punishing: snow-capped peaks, frozen rivers, and narrow trails that limited mobility. Each step carried the risk of ambush, landmines, or hidden sniper positions. Despite the official victory, the soldiers felt as though the war was still very much alive. Reynolds reflected in his journal. "The mountains are silent, yet every shadow feels like a threat. The war is over, or so we were told. Here, it is anything but over." Chapter 30. The Battle of Mittenwald Pass. One of the fiercest engagements occurred at Mittenwald Pass, where German stragglers had fortified a series of bunkers and trenches overlooking the narrow valley. The Allies faced a strategic dilemma: how to neutralize the threat without causing heavy civilian casualties in the nearby village. Corporal Hayes led a reconnaissance team under heavy fire, mapping the positions of German machine gun nests, sniper posts, and mortar locations. Reynolds' unit provided cover, returning precise fire while coordinating with artillery teams positioned safely on higher ground. The battle lasted over 3 days, with intermittent skirmishes, artillery barrages, and hand-to-hand encounters in forested slopes. Though small in scale compared to prior campaigns, the fighting was intense and psychologically taxing. Soldiers had to balance aggression with caution, ensuring civilians and their own units were protected while confronting enemy combatants who refused to surrender. Chapter 31. Acts of Valor and Human Compassion. Amid the chaos, stories of valor and humanity emerged. Reynolds personally rescued a group of Austrian children trapped in a bombed-out farmhouse, carrying them across exposed terrain under enemy fire. Sergeant Hargrove led an operation to evacuate elderly villagers from a nearby hamlet, coordinating with local militia and using smoke screens to protect against German snipers. Even German soldiers demonstrated moments of unexpected humanity.
Some permitted civilians to leave conflict zones unharmed or surrendered voluntarily when confronted with overwhelming Allied strength. These acts reflected a complex reality. Amidst destruction, individuals still made choices guided by honor, ethics, and survival instincts. Chapter 32. The Role of Local Guides and Informants. Local Austrian civilians played a crucial role in guiding Allied forces through the treacherous mountain terrain. Villagers familiar with hidden trails, caves, and mountain passes provided intelligence that helped avoid ambushes and locate isolated German positions. Herr Leopold, a village elder, recalled, "We were scared, yes, but we knew the children had to survive. If we didn't guide the soldiers, more lives would be lost. The mountains were dangerous, but together we could protect what remained of our families." Such cooperation highlighted the interdependence of military forces and civilians in the final stages of post-surrender conflict. Survival often relied as much on local knowledge and courage as on weaponry and strategy. Chapter 33. Tactical Innovation in Post-Surrender Battles. The Langenberg and Mittenwald engagements revealed the necessity of tactical innovation. Soldiers developed new strategies for combat in constrained environments. Small unit infiltration, reconnaissance teams operated independently to gather intelligence. Precision strikes, artillery and sniper teams targeted enemy positions with minimal collateral damage. Civilian evacuation protocols. Troops coordinated with locals to create safe corridors through conflict zones. These innovations were not only tactical, but ethical. Commanders recognized that each action had consequences for both soldiers and civilians, emphasizing the dual responsibility of military leadership to win battles and protect human life. Chapter 34. Psychological Strain and Morale. Prolonged post-surrender combat took a toll on soldiers' mental health. They faced the paradox of fighting when the war was officially over. Anxiety, moral uncertainty, and fear of the unknown pervaded daily life. Reynolds wrote, "Every morning I awake expecting peace, yet the mountains remind me that war lingers. I ask myself, why are we still fighting? And then I see a child or a neighbor rescued, and I know why. We fight because someone must." Despite exhaustion and disillusionment, small victories boosted morale. Saving civilians, negotiating surrenders, and clearing villages gave soldiers purpose, reinforcing the notion that their actions still mattered in shaping the post-war reality. Chapter 36. Civilians Rebuild Amid Uncertainty. Even as battles continued, civilians took steps towards rebuilding their communities. Families repaired homes, planted crops, and reopened schools. Yet uncertainty persisted. Each distant gunshot or sudden movement reminded them that the war was not fully over. In Zell am See, villagers organized community kitchens to feed both civilians and displaced soldiers. Local doctors and nurses, alongside Allied medical teams, provided care for the wounded. These grassroots efforts underscored the resilience and agency of civilian populations in post-conflict recovery. Chapter 37. Communication Breakdowns and Misunderstandings. Post-surrender engagements were frequently exacerbated by communication failures. Isolated German units often received conflicting orders, leading to defensive or aggressive actions based on outdated information. Similarly, Allied units sometimes misinterpreted movements, triggering unnecessary skirmishes. In one notable incident, a misunderstanding over flag signals resulted in a brief exchange of fire in the village of Kitzbühel, causing casualties on both sides. Only afterwards did officers clarify the miscommunication, highlighting how fragile peace could be in post-surrender environments. Chapter 38. Small-scale negotiations and surrenders. Despite the danger, Many German units chose to surrender voluntarily once confronted with overwhelming Allied strength. Negotiations, often conducted under white flags, were tense but crucial in reducing further bloodshed. Leadership in such negotiations often came from individuals who willingly surrendered and persuaded others to follow suit. Lieutenant Karl Weiss, previously mentioned in Tyrol, played a significant role in facilitating such surrenders. By persuading fellow soldiers to lay down arms, he helped prevent additional civilian casualties and shorten the duration of localized combat. These negotiations reflected the human capacity to choose life over ideology, even in the final hours of conflict. Chapter 39. The Legacy of the Post-Surrender Battles. Historians analyzing the Mittenwald Pass engagement and similar conflicts identified enduring lessons. Victory is not instantaneous. Official declarations are symbolic. Actual cessation of violence requires deliberate action. Ethical decision-making matters. Protecting civilians amid combat underscores the moral dimensions of warfare. Local knowledge is critical. Civilians often play indispensable roles in navigating complex environments. Heroism persists in ambiguity. Soldiers and civilians alike demonstrated courage even when the larger war had officially ended. These lessons have informed military strategy, humanitarian operations, and historical understanding, ensuring that the complexity of war's end is recognized and remembered. Chapter 40. Reflections from the Front Lines. In interviews conducted after the war, soldiers recounted the surreal experience of fighting in a conflict officially over. Reynolds described a pervasive sense of dissonance. "We celebrated VE Day in spirit, yet every step in the mountains reminded us that for some, the war was not over. We fought not for glory, but for survival, for families, for a chance to finally live in peace." Such reflections highlight the emotional and psychological complexities of post-surrender combat, revealing the human dimension of historical events often reduced to dates and statistics. Chapter 40. Towards the end of combat. By late May 1945, the majority of isolated German units in southern Germany and Austria had either surrendered or disbanded. Skirmishes became sporadic, and Allied forces shifted focus from combat to stabilization, reconstruction, and humanitarian relief. Soldiers, civilians, and local officials began documenting the events, preserving memories of heroism, tragedy, and moral courage. These accounts would later inform history books, oral histories, and archival research, ensuring that the post-surrender battles were not entirely forgotten. Chapter 41. The Last German Pockets. By early June 1945, most of southern Germany and Austria had experienced partial stabilization, yet a few isolated German units continued resistance. These were often small, heavily armed groups entrenched in forests, hills, and abandoned villages. Their motivations were complex: loyalty to commanders, fear of reprisals, and the chaotic spread of misinformation kept them fighting despite official surrender. Allied forces, including Reynolds' unit, were tasked with locating these pockets and neutralizing them with minimal civilian harm. Patrols moved cautiously, aware that even a single misstep could reignite hostilities or endanger local populations. Chapter 42. Skirmishes in the Black Forest. One of the last major encounters occurred in the dense Black Forest of southwestern Germany. The terrain was thick with trees, underbrush, and uneven ground, perfect for ambushes. German soldiers, remnants of the Wehrmacht, had set up traps and hidden firing positions. Reynolds' platoon engaged in a series of skirmishes that tested both physical endurance and tactical ingenuity. They used flanking maneuvers, suppressive fire, and coordinated assaults with artillery support. The engagements lasted days, with sporadic bursts of intense combat, followed by tense periods of waiting and reconnaissance. Despite being officially over, the fighting was real and deadly. Each soldier understood that even a minor lapse could result in death. The war may have ended on paper, but on the ground, every decision mattered. Chapter 43: Personal Sacrifice and Bravery. During one skirmish, Sergeant Hargrove noticed a German sniper targeting civilians attempting to flee a nearby village. He personally led a flanking operation to neutralize the threat, risking his own life to protect innocents. Private Reynolds also displayed remarkable courage. When a fellow soldier was pinned down by sniper fire on a ridge, Reynolds exposed himself to enemy fire to drag his comrade to safety. Both men were later commended for their bravery, reflecting the enduring heroism that characterized post-surrender combat. Chapter 44: Civilians and the Human Cost. The civilian toll, though reduced compared to larger battles, remained significant. Families were displaced, homes damaged, and crops destroyed. The psychological impact was profound. People believed the war was over, only to face renewed violence in their hometowns. In one hamlet, Frau Hilda Meier recalled hiding for hours in a cellar as gunfire echoed overhead. "We thought the war was finished. We could see the sunrise, hear the birds, yet the shooting continued. It was a cruel reminder that peace is never instantaneous." Civilians often became inadvertent participants in the conflict, navigating the dangers between opposing forces and seeking safety wherever possible. Chapter 45: Negotiated Surrenders. Many German units eventually recognized the futility of continued resistance. Negotiations were initiated under white flags, allowing for peaceful surrenders and minimizing further casualties. Lieutenant Karl Weiss, a former German officer, facilitated several such negotiations. By encouraging his men to lay down arms, he played a pivotal role in preventing additional deaths and ensuring that civilians could resume their lives with less fear. These interactions highlighted the importance of leadership, communication, and pragmatism in ending localized conflicts. Chapter 46: Rebuilding and Recovery begins. As combat subsided, Allied forces focused on stabilization and reconstruction. Temporary governments were established in towns and villages, supplies were distributed, and displaced civilians began returning home. Soldiers assisted in clearing debris, rebuilding roads, and providing medical care. Local populations, despite trauma and loss, displayed remarkable resilience. Schools reopened, shops restocked, and community kitchens fed families and soldiers alike. The slow return to normalcy was a testament to human endurance and the capacity to rebuild even after unexpected violence. Chapter 47: Psychological Aftermath for Soldiers. For soldiers like Reynolds and Hargrove, the post-surrender engagements left lasting psychological effects. Diaries and letters reveal moral dilemmas, anxiety, and stress stemming from continued combat despite the official end of the war. Reynolds wrote in June 1945, "We fought when the world celebrated peace. Every step we took reminded us that the war was real, that death still walked among us. I am glad we survived, but I carry the weight of those who did not." Psychologists studying post-war trauma later noted that these soldiers experienced unique forms of stress. The dissonance between official victory and ongoing danger created lingering anxiety and moral questioning. Chapter 48: Acts of Compassion in the Final Days. Even amidst danger, acts of compassion were abundant. Soldiers rescued trapped civilians, provided food and medical care, and mediated conflicts between local populations and rogue soldiers. Reynolds recounted a moment when he shared his last rations with a family of refugees. They had nothing, and we had enough to spare. War does not always mean cruelty. Sometimes it is the small kindnesses that define humanity. Such moments underscored the moral dimension of post-surrender warfare, where courage was measured not only in combat, but in ethical choices. Chapter 49. The Role of Intelligence and Local Knowledge. Allied intelligence remained crucial even in the war's final days. Reconnaissance flights, intercepted communications, and local guides allowed commanders to locate remaining German units efficiently. Villagers familiar with forests, mountain passes, and hidden trails helped prevent ambushes and guided soldiers safely through complex terrain. The combination of military strategy and civilian knowledge ensured that the remaining pockets of resistance could be addressed without unnecessary loss of life. Chapter 50. The Last Engagements. By mid-June 1945, the remaining German units were either neutralized or surrendered. Skirmishes became sporadic and scattered, often lasting only a few hours. The soldiers who had fought tirelessly through these post-surrender battles were exhausted, both physically and mentally. For Reynolds and his comrades, the final engagements were bittersweet. Relief at the end of combat mingled with sorrow for lost friends and civilians. They had fought battles that were technically unnecessary but morally significant, shaping the transition from war to peace. Chapter 51. Commemoration of Heroes. In the years following the war, veterans like Reynolds and Hargrove were recognized for their bravery and service. Commemorative ceremonies honored acts of heroism, particularly those that saved civilians or facilitated peaceful surrenders. Local communities also celebrated resilience. Plaques, memorials, and oral histories preserved the stories of both soldiers and civilians who endured the post-surrender battles, ensuring that the lessons of courage, morality, and humanity were remembered for generations. Chapter 52. Historical Perspective. Historians have emphasized that post-surrender battles like Langenberg and Mittenwald challenged traditional narratives of war's end. While Germany had officially surrendered on May 7, 1945, reality on the ground was far more complex. These engagements reveal the uneven nature of victory and peace, the moral and ethical challenges faced by soldiers, the resilience of civilian populations in war zones, the importance of local intelligence, communication, and leadership in resolving conflicts. Ultimately, these battles demonstrate that the end of war is a process, not a single event. Chapter 53. Reflections from Civilians. Civilians who survived these post-surrender battles carried stories of fear, courage, and hope.
Many expressed gratitude for the soldiers who protected them, while others mourned the lives lost and homes destroyed. Frau Hilda Meier reflected decades later, quote, "The world celebrated victory, but we lived it slowly. Every day was uncertain, every moment precious. The war did not end on paper. It ended when we felt safe again." Such testimonials provide a human dimension to historical records, reminding us that history is not just about dates and documents, but lived experiences. Chapter 54. The Transition to Peace. By late June 1945, combat had fully ceased in southern Germany and Austria. Allied forces shifted from combat operations to occupation, stabilization, and humanitarian support. Villages and towns began to rebuild, civilians returned to their routines, and soldiers received orders for demobilization.
The transition was gradual, reflecting the reality that peace is not instant, but a process of restoration, healing, and reconciliation. Communities worked together to repair infrastructure, recover lost property, and reintegrate soldiers and civilians into a peaceful society. Chapter 55. Lessons for Future Generations. The post-surrender battles offer several enduring lessons. 1. Victory is complex. Formal surrender does not guarantee immediate cessation of hostilities. 2. Ethics in warfare matter. Protecting civilians amidst combat is crucial. 3. Human resilience is remarkable. Both soldiers and civilians displayed extraordinary courage. 4. Documentation preserves memory. Letters, diaries, and oral histories ensure that these stories are not forgotten. By studying these events, future generations gain insight into the moral, psychological, and tactical dimensions of conflict, emphasizing that history is shaped by both large-scale events and individual actions. Chapter 56. Consolidation of Peace. By early July 1945, Allied forces had fully secured southern Germany and Austrian territories. Most German units had surrendered, while the remaining stragglers either disbanded or were captured. Soldiers, exhausted from prolonged post-surrender skirmishes, finally felt the relief of cessation of combat. Private Reynolds reflected on the surreal nature of this period. Having fought continuously after the official surrender, he realized that the war's end was not a single event, but a process unfolding over weeks. His letters to family captured a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and ongoing anxiety. Quote, "The world celebrated victory, but yet we still walk through ruins, haunted by what was and what might have been. Still, we survived." Chapter 58. Healing Psychological Wounds. The psychological impact of post-surrender combat lingered for both soldiers and civilians. Soldiers like Reynolds and Hargrove faced PTSD-like symptoms, nightmares, hypervigilance, and moral questioning. They struggled to reconcile the notion of victory with the reality of extended combat. Civilians, particularly children, displayed signs of trauma from prolonged exposure to violence. Social and community initiatives, including storytelling, communal meals, and informal counseling by soldiers and local elders, played a vital role in mental recovery. Historian Dr. Helene Fisher later noted, quote, "The post-surrender period was a unique phase of war trauma. The uncertainty of continued combat after formal surrender created a liminal space between conflict and peace, where ordinary people and soldiers alike had to navigate fear and hope simultaneously." Chapter 59. Heroic Legacies. Stories of heroism persisted beyond the battlefield. Reynolds' daring rescue of civilians, Hargrove's evacuations, and other acts of bravery became part of local lore. Communities erected memorials and plaques, recognizing both Allied and German soldiers who chose humanity over ideology. These acts were not only military feats, but also moral triumphs, illustrating the enduring capacity for courage and ethical decision-making in even the most chaotic circumstances. Chapter 60. Reconciliation and Dialogue. In the aftermath of combat, Allied forces facilitated dialogue between civilians and former German soldiers. Former adversaries worked together to rebuild towns, repair infrastructure, and restore essential services. Such collaboration fostered a sense of reconciliation, allowing communities to transition from fear to cooperation. Lieutenant Weiss, who had led negotiations earlier, became a key figure in promoting trust between former combatants and civilians. His efforts helped smooth tensions, ensuring that lingering hostilities did not flare into renewed violence. Chapter 61. The Role of Documentation. Letters, diaries, and military dispatches from this period became invaluable historical records. Reynolds' journals, along with official reports, preserved the reality of combat that continued after the official surrender. Historians later used these documents to reconstruct events, understanding both tactical engagements and human experiences. The preservation of these records highlighted the importance of documenting even small-scale or forgotten conflicts in the broader narrative of World War II. Chapter 62, Community Stories and Memories. Civilians' oral histories captured personal experiences often overlooked in official accounts. Frau Hilda Meier's testimonies, along with those of others, painted vivid pictures of fear, resilience, and hope. Quote, "The world celebrated, but we lived each day with uncertainty. Every sound of gunfire reminded us that the war was still alive, even as people tried to rebuild their lives." Chapter 63, Reconstruction of Infrastructure. Allied engineers and soldiers collaborated with local populations to rebuild essential infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and communication lines were repaired to facilitate trade, aid delivery, and governance. Temporary schools were established for children, while community centers served as hubs for medical care and social support. These efforts underscored the interdependence of military, civilian, and international assistance in post-conflict reconstruction. Chapter 64, Lessons Learned. The post-surrender battles left enduring lessons for military strategy and humanitarian operations. 1. War's end is a process, not a date. Even after official surrender, conflict may continue. 2. Ethical responsibility remains paramount. Protecting civilians must be a priority, even in residual combat. 3. Civilian cooperation is critical. Local knowledge and participation can save lives and accelerate peace. 4. Documentation preserves memory. Personal accounts ensure that forgotten battles are remembered and studied. These insights informed future military doctrine, particularly in managing occupation, guerrilla resistance, and post-conflict stabilization. Chapter 65, Reflections of Soldiers. Soldiers like Reynolds and Hargrove reflected on their experiences with both pride and sorrow. While grateful for survival, they mourned fallen comrades and civilians caught in crossfire. Quote, "Victory was declared, yet we felt the cost firsthand. Every life lost, every home destroyed weighed heavily on us. Still, the kindness we witnessed, soldiers helping civilians, enemies choosing surrender, reminded us of humanity in war." Such reflections illustrate the duality of combat. Heroism and tragedy coexist, shaping memories and historical narratives. Chapter 66, The Broader Historical Significance. Post-surrender battles challenged simplistic understandings of World War II's conclusion. They reveal that the official surrender of a nation does not instantly end hostilities. Moral decisions in residual combat can have lasting social and historical impact. Civilians' resilience and participation are crucial in the transition to peace. Documenting these events ensure their inclusion in historical memory. These insights emphasize that the end of war is both a temporal and human phenomenon, requiring careful attention to strategy, ethics, and humanitarian considerations. Chapter 67, Establishing Stability. By July 1945, stability gradually returned to southern Germany and Austrian territories. Allied forces began transitioning from combat operations to governance, humanitarian assistance, and demobilization. Soldiers assisted in restoring law and order, coordinating relief distribution, and helping civilians navigate bureaucratic challenges. Communities slowly regained a sense of normalcy, though the scars of post-surrender conflict remained visible in both landscape and memory. Chapter 68. Honoring the Fallen. Memorials and ceremonies were established to honor soldiers and civilians who perished during post-surrender battles. Names of both Allied and German combatants were inscribed, reflecting a recognition of shared human experience and sacrifice. These commemorations fostered reconciliation and ensured that the moral and physical costs of residual warfare were not forgotten. They also emphasized the importance of remembering lesser-known episodes of World War II, broadening historical understanding beyond major campaigns. Chapter 69. Personal Closure for Soldiers. For Reynolds, Hargrove, and others, the final weeks of post-surrender operations offered a measure of closure. Completing evacuation operations, assisting civilians, and witnessing voluntary surrenders allowed them to reconcile their actions with the broader narrative of victory. Reynolds wrote in a final journal entry, "The war ended not with a single day, but in moments of courage, compassion, and resilience. We fought, we saved, we mourned, and finally we began to live again." Chapter 70. Reflections on Humanity Amid War. The post-surrender battles revealed the enduring complexity of human behavior in conflict. Soldiers demonstrated courage, ethical decision-making, and empathy. Civilians displayed resilience, resourcefulness, and hope. These stories remind us that even in the darkest moments, humanity can persist, guiding choices and shaping historical outcomes. The legacy of these battles is not only tactical, but moral, offering lessons for generations to come. Chapter 71. Final German Resistance. By late July 1945, only a few scattered German groups remained in remote areas of southern Germany and Austria. These were often small, well-hidden units reluctant to accept the war's end due to misinformation or fear of reprisal. Allied commanders organized targeted operations to address these final pockets without causing unnecessary civilian casualties. Small mobile units were deployed to locate and negotiate surrender, often working with local guides familiar with forests, mountains, and villages. Private Reynolds described the surreal nature of these operations. "It felt like chasing shadows. The war was officially over, yet we were still hunting soldiers who refused to lay down their arms. Every encounter tested our patience and morality." In many cases, dialogue replaced direct combat. Lieutenant Weiss, leveraging his prior relations with German officers, facilitated several peaceful surrenders. These negotiations reduced casualties and demonstrated that communication and leadership were more powerful than brute force in resolving lingering hostilities. One notable instance occurred in a small Tyrolean village. A German platoon had fortified an abandoned schoolhouse. Rather than assaulting the position, Weiss initiated dialogue. After tense hours, the platoon surrendered voluntarily, allowing Allied troops to secure the area without bloodshed. Such events highlighted the importance of moral courage and diplomacy in concluding post-surrender operations. Chapter 73. Civilians and the Aftermath. Civilians were the silent survivors of these extended conflicts. Families who had hidden for weeks or months gradually emerged, reclaiming their homes and livelihoods. Children returned to schools, markets reopened, and local governance resumed under Allied supervision. Despite the return to relative normalcy, trauma remained. Frau Hilda Meier recalled, "Even as the war ended for everyone else, for us, every day was a test of courage. We had survived the official surrender, but our hearts had not yet caught up." Communities organized mutual aid, sharing food, labor, and resources to rebuild what had been lost. These collective efforts were essential in restoring trust and stability after prolonged uncertainty. Chapter 74. Heroism in the Final Days. Acts of heroism continued until the very last engagements. Reynolds personally led the evacuation of trapped villagers in the Alps while under sporadic fire from isolated German snipers. Sergeant Hargrove coordinated medical care for both Allied and German wounded in remote valleys. These final acts underscored the enduring human spirit, demonstrating courage, ethical responsibility, and compassion in circumstances where combat and humanitarian duties intersected. Chapter 76. Transition to Civil Administration. With most combat concluded, Allied forces shifted focus to civil administration. Militia police, engineers, and liaison officers worked with local leaders to restore law, order, and services. Bridges and roads were repaired, schools reopened, and basic utilities were restored. Soldiers often assisted with reconstruction, blurring the line between combatant and humanitarian worker. The transition emphasized that ending war required more than surrender. It demanded active rebuilding of social, political, and economic structures. Chapter 76. Psychological Recovery. Soldiers faced the challenge of transitioning from combat to peace. Diaries, letters, and later interviews revealed persistent stress, moral questioning, and reflections on survival. Reynolds wrote, "We survived battles no one else remembered. The war ended, but our memories did not. Peace was not a single moment, it was a process we had to live through." Psychologists later noted that post-surrender conflict created unique forms of trauma. Soldiers had to reconcile the dissonance between official victory and ongoing danger, while civilians navigated fear, uncertainty, and loss. Chapter 77. Commemorations and Memory. In the months and years following the final skirmishes, communities established memorials and ceremonies to honor those who had perished. Both soldiers and civilians were recognized for bravery, sacrifice, and resilience. Plaques and monuments listed the names of fallen Allied and German soldiers, acknowledging the shared human cost of the final battles. These commemorations fostered reconciliation and ensured that the lessons of courage, morality, and humanity endured for generations to come. Chapter 78. Historical Documentation. Historians and archivists later compiled detailed records of the post-surrender conflicts. Reynolds' diaries, official reports, and civilian testimonies provided a comprehensive understanding of the events. These records demonstrated that while the official surrender of Germany marked a symbolic victory, the reality on the ground involved continued struggle, complex human decisions, and enduring challenges to peace. Historical analysis emphasized 4 key lessons. Official surrender does not immediately end violence. Ethical and moral decision-making shapes post-conflict outcomes. Civilian participation is critical in restoring stability. Documentation ensures that the nuanced reality of post-conflict periods is preserved. Chapter 80. Long-term social impacts. The post-surrender battles had lasting social effects. Communities were strengthened through collective resilience and mutual aid. Survivors developed networks of support that persisted for decades. Children who had hidden for weeks or months adapted to new realities, often influenced by the bravery and moral choices of soldiers like Reynolds and Hargrove. Adults rebuilt social structures, establishing schools, local councils, and communal resources. These efforts laid the foundation for post-war recovery and long-term peace in the region. Chapter 81. Soldiers' Reflection on Humanity. Reynolds reflected on the moral lessons of the post-surrender battles. "We fought after the world thought it was over. Every act of courage, every choice to save a life rather than take one, taught me that war is not only about strategy, but about humanity. In these moments, we learned what it truly meant to be human." His reflections, echoed by comrades and civilians, highlight the enduring ethical dimension of combat, especially in situations where official declarations of peace do not align with on-the-ground realities. Chapter 82. End of combat operations. By August 1945, all remaining combat operations had ceased. German soldiers either surrendered, returned home, or were taken into custody. Allied forces began transitioning fully to occupation, reconstruction, and support of local governance. Soldiers, civilians, and international authorities focused on rebuilding trust, infrastructure, and community life. The final weeks of post-surrender combat became historical footnotes, but their lessons and human stories remained profound. Chapter 83. The Broader Historical Perspective. The post-surrender battles illustrate the complexity of ending a war. Despite formal surrender, scattered resistance, miscommunication, and
fear prolonged conflict. Key historical insights include: peace requires active engagement beyond formal agreements. Moral and ethical choices define the human legacy of war. Civilian involvement is indispensable in securing stability. Documentation ensures that the nuanced reality of post-conflict periods is preserved. Chapter 83. Personal Narratives and Legacies. Personal stories from soldiers and civilians provide the most vivid insights into these events. Reynolds' journals, letters from Hargrove, and civilian testimonies illustrate fear, courage, compassion, and moral decision-making. These narratives humanize the abstract idea of war, highlighting individual experiences and ethical dilemmas in a world officially at peace, yet still consumed by localized violence. Chapter 84. The Return to Normal Life. As combat ceased, soldiers began returning home, and civilians resumed everyday routines. Schools, markets, and municipal services gradually normalized. Families reunited, communities rebuilt, and social networks strengthened. Though the physical and emotional scars remained, the experience fostered resilience. Communities emerged stronger, having endured and survived post-surrender battles that were technically unnecessary but morally significant. Chapter 85. Reflection on Courage and Humanity. The post-surrender battles left an enduring legacy. Courage, compassion, and moral fortitude persisted even in situations where official war declarations were irrelevant. Soldiers and civilians alike made choices that preserved life, dignity, and humanity. These lessons remain timeless, providing insight into human behavior under extreme conditions and illustrating that even in war, humanity can prevail. Chapter 96. Final Reconciliations. By September 1945, all active combat had ended. The last German soldiers had either surrendered, gone into hiding peacefully, or been reintegrated into civilian life under Allied supervision. Local communities, devastated by the chaos of post-surrender skirmishes, began organizing reconciliation efforts. Public meetings were held to address grievances, redistribute property, and restore trust among neighbors who had lived through fear and uncertainty. Reynolds observed, "The war's end is not a single moment, it is a process of healing, listening, and rebuilding. Here, we finally began that process." Chapter 87. Returning Home. Soldiers slowly returned home. Reynolds and his comrades boarded transport ships and trains, leaving behind the mountains and villages where they had faced the final battles of World War II. Letters home captured a mixture of relief and lingering trauma. "We survived battles no one remembers in history books. Our minds carry memories of fear, courage, and compassion that no medal can measure." Reintegration into civilian life was not immediate. Many soldiers struggled to process the moral and psychological weight of their experiences. Chapter 88. Civilian Recovery. Communities rebuilt with remarkable resilience. Farmers repaired fields, merchants reopened shops, and schools welcomed children back.
The collective trauma remained, but the shared experience of survival fostered stronger social bonds. Local leaders, often former militia members, coordinated with Allied authorities to establish law, order, and basic governance. Efforts focused on ensuring stability, distributing aid, and reconstructing essential services like hospitals, water systems, and communication lines. Chapter 90. Documenting Forgotten Battles. The events of the post-surrender battles, often overshadowed by major World War II campaigns, were meticulously documented. Diaries like Reynolds, reports from military units, and civilian testimonies formed the backbone of historical understanding. Historians emphasize that these battles challenge simplified notions of victory. While the war was officially ended, human experience on the ground told a story of continued conflict, moral complexity, and heroic acts that shaped communities. Chapter 90. Heroes Beyond Recognition. Many acts of bravery went unrecognized in formal military histories. Soldiers who rescued civilians, mediated surrenders, or risked lives to protect innocents were rarely cited in national records. Yet local memorials, oral histories, and private journals preserved these stories. Reynolds and Hargrove became quiet local heroes, celebrated not for glory, but for the lives they saved and the moral choices they made during chaos. Chapter 91. Long-term social impact. The post-surrender battles influenced the social and political landscape of southern Germany and Austria for decades. Survivors carried lessons of resilience, cooperation, and moral responsibility. Communities established networks of mutual support, leveraging lessons learned during crisis. These social structures helped shape post-war recovery, emphasizing the role of human agency in rebuilding lives after conflict. Chapter 92. Ethical Lessons from Post-Surrender Combat. Historians analyzing these events highlight enduring ethical lessons. Moral courage matters. Soldiers often faced situations where the right choice was not clear-cut. Protecting civilians is paramount. Even minor operations required ethical consideration. Leadership shapes outcomes. Officers like Lieutenant Weiss demonstrated the power of guidance and negotiation. Compassion persists. Amid chaos, small acts of kindness saved lives and preserved humanity. These lessons transcend the battlefield, offering insight into human behavior in extreme circumstances. Chapter 93. Psychological Reflections. For soldiers, the end of post-surrender battles was bittersweet. Relief at the cessation of combat was tempered by memories of fear, moral dilemmas, and lost comrades. Reynolds' diary entry from September 1945 captures this. Peace feels strange. We fought battles no one acknowledges, yet every life saved counts. I carry sorrow and pride together. The war may have ended, but the weight of its aftermath lingers. Civilians shared similar reflections, balancing gratitude with the trauma of unexpected violence and prolonged uncertainty. Chapter 94. Reconstruction of Infrastructure. Allied forces and local communities worked together to rebuild infrastructure damaged during the post-surrender battles. Roads, bridges, water systems, and schools were restored. Soldiers participated actively, helping with construction, transporting materials, and coordinating logistics. Their efforts symbolized a shift from destruction to creation, emphasizing the transition from combat to peace. Chapter 95. Final Acts of Humanity. Even after hostilities ceased, soldiers continued acts of humanity. Reynolds documented instances of assisting displaced families, returning stolen property, and mediating disputes between local civilians. These actions reinforced the moral dimension of military service. Winning a war is not only about defeating enemies, but also about restoring justice, security, and dignity for those affected. Chapter 96, Community Reconciliation. Communities held ceremonies to foster reconciliation between former German soldiers and civilians. Villagers who had suffered during skirmishes worked alongside former combatants to rebuild homes, farms, and schools. Such collaboration helped heal divisions, demonstrating the power of dialogue, mutual effort, and shared purpose in achieving lasting peace. Chapter 97, Historical Legacy. The post-surrender battles left an enduring historical legacy. They remind us that war's end is often gradual and complex. Courage and ethical action can coexist even in chaotic circumstances. Civilian resilience shapes recovery and long-term stability. Documentation preserves lessons that may otherwise be forgotten. These insights broaden our understanding of World War II, highlighting the hidden struggles that persisted after official victory. Chapter 98, Veterans' Reflections. Reynolds and Hargrove, along with fellow veterans, reflected on their experiences in interviews decades later. They emphasized that survival, moral choice, and human compassion defined the post-surrender battles more than military strategy alone. We fought after the world thought it was over. The bravery of civilians and soldiers alike taught us the true meaning of courage, Reynolds said. Such reflections ensure that these often overlooked battles remain part of collective memory. Chapter 99, Lessons for Future Generations. The story of post-surrender combat serves as a guide for understanding the complexity of war and peace. 1. Victory is not a date, but a process. 2. Moral responsibility continues beyond official surrender. 3. Civilians play a critical role in stabilizing societies. 4. Preservation of memory ensures that lessons endure. These lessons resonate beyond World War II, informing military strategy, humanitarian work, and historical scholarship. Chapter 100, Concluding Reflections. The battle that happened after Germany surrendered illustrates that war's end is never simple. While Germany had officially surrendered on May 7, 1945, the realities on the ground were far more complex. Soldiers like Reynolds and Hargrove, civilians like Frau Hilda Meier and Herr Leopold, and countless others navigated fear, moral dilemmas, and chaos. Their courage, compassion, and resilience shaped the path to peace. Ultimately, this forgotten chapter of history reminds us that humanity can prevail even in moments of uncertainty, that courage is not limited to the battlefield, and that history is written not only in grand victories, but also in the quiet, moral choices of individuals. Chapter 101, Epilogue. The Mountains Grow Silent. By late September 1945, the mountains and villages that had seen some of the last post-surrender battles were finally quiet. Snow had begun to melt in the Bavarian Alps, rivers flowed calmly, and forests, once echoing with gunfire, returned to their natural serenity. Private James Reynolds, standing on a ridge overlooking Mittenwald Pass, reflected on the months of uncertainty and violence. The war is over, officially, but it took months for peace to arrive here. Every life saved, every hand extended to a stranger was part of that peace. For the soldiers, the silence was both relief and reminder. Relief that combat had ceased, and reminder of the lives lost and scars left behind, both visible and invisible. Chapter 102, Long-Term Social Impacts. Communities permanently transformed. Villages in southern Germany and Austria developed stronger bonds born out of shared hardship. The cooperation between civilians and Allied forces created networks of mutual support, helping communities recover more efficiently. Children who had hidden in cellars or forests returned to school with a deeper understanding of resilience and empathy. Families rebuilt homes and businesses, often working side by side with former soldiers. These experiences left lasting impressions on both local identity and regional culture. Chapter 103: Soldiers' Reintegration. Reynolds, Hargrove, and their comrades returned to civilian life, carrying experiences few outside the battlefields could understand. They faced challenges: reintegration into normal society, dealing with trauma, and finding purpose after months of intense post-surrender operations. Community recognition, local memorials, and reunions with rescued civilians provided some closure. Veterans organizations also formed to preserve memories, share experiences, and provide mutual support. Reynolds wrote, "The battlefield taught me the value of every life, the power of courage, and the cost of indifference. Carrying these lessons forward is my duty." Chapter 104: Last Acts of Reconciliation. Former German soldiers, once adversaries, began reintegrating into communities under Allied supervision. Programs encouraged participation in rebuilding efforts, education, and civic engagement. Local reconciliation ceremonies emphasized forgiveness, empathy, and shared responsibility. Through dialogue and cooperative action, former enemies became neighbors, contributing to societal reconstruction and long-term peace. Chapter 105: Historical Documentation and Research. Historians and scholars began studying the post-surrender battles in depth. Diaries like Reynolds, letters from Hargrove, and civilian testimonies became primary sources. Military records, photographs, and local archives were cross-referenced to create an accurate narrative of events. The research revealed lessons in ethics, leadership, and human behavior during times of uncertainty. 1. Victory is a process, not a single event. 2. Moral courage often outweighs strategy in determining outcomes. 3. Civilians are essential actors in conflict resolution. 4. Documentation ensures that even forgotten battles are remembered. These studies contributed to a broader understanding of World War II, highlighting the complexity of post-surrender realities. Chapter 106: Personal Stories Remembered. Reynolds' journal entries, civilian interviews, and local commemorations preserved the human element of these battles. Reynolds risked his life repeatedly to save civilians and fellow soldiers. Hargrove coordinated medical aid under fire and facilitated evacuations. Frau Hilda Meier survived the Black Forest skirmishes and later helped other displaced families. Herr Leopold guided Allied forces through mountain passes, saving lives and enabling peaceful surrenders. These individuals' actions underscored that heroism is not always about glory. Often it is about choosing compassion and courage under uncertainty. Chapter 107: Psychological Legacy. The post-surrender battles created a unique psychological legacy. Soldiers and civilians alike dealt with trauma from fighting after official victory, moral dilemmas, and prolonged fear. Veterans' mental health programs emerged in the post-war years, recognizing the distinct nature of post-surrender combat stress. Civilians developed coping mechanisms, forming support networks and community rituals to manage lingering anxiety. The experiences became a case study in understanding human resilience under complex, morally ambiguous situations. Chapter 108: The Moral Dimension of War. The battles revealed that the end of war is not merely strategic or political, but fundamentally moral. Decisions to protect civilians, negotiate surrender, and exercise restraint reflected ethical courage. Reynolds reflected, The true battle was not only against enemies, but also against fear, hatred, and indifference. Every act of humanity counted as much as every firefight. This moral dimension became central in post-war military doctrine and humanitarian operations worldwide. Chapter 109, Commemorations and Memorials. Communities established lasting memorials honoring soldiers and civilians involved in post-surrender battles. Monuments in Mittenwald, Zell am See, and Longenburg listed names of both Allied and German participants, emphasizing shared sacrifice. Annual ceremonies were held to remember the human cost and celebrate resilience, compassion, and cooperation. These commemorations ensured that future generations understood that history is shaped by both grand campaigns and smaller, often forgotten events. Chapter 110, The Broader Historical Significance. The post-surrender battles are a testament to the complexities of war. They highlight that 1. Official declarations do not guarantee peace. 2. Human courage and moral action define outcomes. 3. Civilians are essential actors in conflict resolution. 4. Documentation ensures that even forgotten battles are remembered. These insights challenged simplified narratives of war's end, offering a nuanced understanding of history's most turbulent moments. Chapter 111, Reflections Across Generations. Decades later, veterans and civilians shared stories of these battles. Schools incorporated local history, emphasizing heroism, morality, and resilience. Historians referenced these events to illustrate the human complexities behind military and political decisions. Victory on paper is easy, Reynolds once said in a lecture decades later. Peace is what we make of it, through compassion, courage, and the willingness to rebuild. Chapter 112, The Lasting Legacy. The story of the battles after Germany's surrender leaves a lasting legacy. For soldiers, lessons of bravery, moral courage, and empathy. For civilians, resilience, cooperation, and survival under uncertainty. For history, documentation and remembrance that ensure these events are not forgotten.
The legacy reinforces that human decisions, ethics, and compassion can shape the course of history, even in moments overshadowed by large-scale military operations. Chapter 113, Concluding Thoughts. The battle that happened after Germany surrendered reminds us that history is rarely linear or simple. Official dates mark milestones, but the human experience of war often extends far beyond them. Soldiers like Reynolds and Hargrove demonstrated courage and humanity. Civilians like Frau Hilda Meier and Herr Leopold Meier exemplified resilience and resourcefulness. Communities collectively rebuilt, learned, and preserved memory. The story of post-surrender battles illustrates that the end of war is a process shaped by courage, compassion, and moral choice, not merely by treaties or declarations. Chapter 114, Final Reflection. As peace finally settled across the Alps and southern Germany, the world learned that true victory is measured not just by military conquest, but by the restoration of humanity, society, and dignity. The mountains grew silent, but the stories of bravery, sacrifice, and compassion continue to echo through time. They remind us that in the aftermath of chaos, human resilience, ethical courage, and collective effort define both the meaning and the enduring legacy of war.